Early fall in Maple Glen, a small town tucked between rolling Pennsylvania hills and a stretch of highway that locals swore had more potholes than people, was the kind of season where the air felt crisp but not fully cold, like nature had exhaled a minty breath over the land. The trees lining Oakridge Road, one of the older, narrower community roads, were starting to show splashes of deep amber and burnt orange, like someone had taken a paintbrush and flicked autumn across their leaves. The sunlight was warm enough to be comforting, but the breeze had an attitude, the kind that made loose papers, lightweight jackets, and occasionally small dogs rethink their life choices. It was the sort of morning where everything felt possible, and apparently, that included unexpected disaster, something no one informs you of when you leave your driveway feeling productive. Evan Parker, early 30s, curious-eyed and always in a hurry he pretended wasn't his fault, was on his way to a morning meeting in downtown Maple Glen. He wasn't dressed fancy, just a simple navy zip-up hoodie, a soft grey t-shirt underneath, dark jeans, and scuffed brown sneakers. The outfit screamed, "I'm functional, not fashionable," which, to be fair, matched the mood of his car, a 2012 silver Honda Civic that rattled only when it felt like being dramatic. Evan had been telling himself for 2 years that he'd get the rattle checked next week, but next week never showed up on his calendar in the same way chores never showed up on his motivation list. He was sipping a lukewarm gas station coffee, which he regretted buying but would absolutely finish because he'd spent $2.29 on it, and anything over $2 was now considered a personal commitment. The coffee smelled like it had been brewed during last year's fall season and clung to the cup with the desperation of a beverage that knew it wasn't wanted. Just as he passed the familiar landmark of the Maple Glen water tower, big, blue, and repainted every 3 years because teenagers kept sneaking up to draw smiley faces on it, Evan heard a noise that can only be described as the sigh of something giving up. Thump, thump, flap. His car wiggled slightly left. The steering wheel vibrated in his hands. A small chirp came from the front right corner of the vehicle, as if the tire itself said, "It's been real, buddy." "Are you kidding me?" Evan groaned, pulling over to the gravel shoulder. He was already mentally bargaining with the universe. "Okay, look, I'll recycle more, I'll hold doors open for strangers, I'll even stop complaining about Monday mornings if you let this be a stick I ran over." But no. He stepped out, knelt down, and saw the truth. A flat tire so flat it looked like it was trying to become a pancake. The wind immediately chose this moment to blow harder, sending a flurry of yellow leaves swirling around him like nature was trying to mock him with confetti. A single leaf stuck to his hoodie and dramatically fluttered near his chest like some earth-toned badge of defeat. Evan peeled it off with mild annoyance, and as he did, his lukewarm coffee somehow tipped over in slow motion and splashed across the gravel, adding insult to injury. Of course the coffee would go too. Maple Glen residents loved to describe themselves as helpful but nosy, and Oakridge Road was the unofficial runway for such personalities. Barely 5 minutes after Evan popped his trunk to pull out the spare tire and toolkit, tools he had only touched once, in a YouTube tutorial he gave up on after 7 minutes, an older brown pickup truck rolled to a stop behind him, dust puffing around its tires. Out stepped George Whitman, early 60s, grey beard, plaid shirt, and the gait of a man who had been repairing things longer than Evan had been alive. George's pace was slow, steady, and somehow both relaxed and authoritative, like he was the sheriff of roadside problems. "Flat tire," George called out. Evan blinked in obvious sarcasm. "No, just giving it a quick massage. I think it's stressed." George snorted. "Yep, sarcasm. You're officially stranded." He walked up, squatted down faster than any 60-year-old should legally be allowed to, and inspected the damage. "You hit something nasty." Evan hadn't, at least not recently. But the tire wasn't just flat, it was destroyed, like something had clawed into it. George shook his head and stood with a groan. "Welp, you wanna do the honors, or you want me to pretend to supervise while doing all the work?" "I was planning to do it myself," Evan said, sounding unconvincing even to himself. George eyed him. "Son, I've changed more tires than you've eaten breakfasts this year." "That's probably true." Before Evan could argue further, another car slowed down, an SUV this time. Out hopped Claire Thompson, early 70s, short silver hair, cheerful expression, and wearing a floral sweater that practically radiated grandmotherly warmth. She carried a reusable grocery bag like it was a purse and waved at both men with enough enthusiasm to power a small town. "What's all this commotion?" she asked. "I thought someone was giving away free pies." "Just Evan here losing an argument with his tire," George said. Claire leaned over and assessed the situation like a medical professional checking a patient. Oof, that tire's flatter than my first attempt at pancakes. Evan sighed. Thanks, really, I feel supported. Oh, we support you, she said, patting his arm. But we can still be honest. The early fall breeze picked up again, tossing Claire's short hair and sending another handful of yellow leaves flying across the road. The sun peeked between drifting clouds, casting shifting light over the three figures, almost like a camera operator trying to get a dramatic shot without fully committing. Evan bent down, pulled out the jack, and awkwardly positioned it. He'd watched enough tutorials to know the theory, but executing it in real life was a whole different ballgame, one where he apparently forgot the rules. The jack kept slipping, and Evan kept repositioning it. George sighed and stepped forward again. Let me. No, Evan insisted, I've got it. The jack fell sideways with a clank. You sure? Absolutely. The jack fell again. Claire clapped politely like he was at least giving effort. Points for trying. Finally, George crouched down and grabbed the tool, pushing Evan aside with the subtlety of a bouncer escorting out someone too tipsy to remain coherent. Meanwhile, a minivan slowed down, and Linda Carver rolled down her window. Mid-40s, organized, steady, and the type of neighbor who kept color-coded calendars without irony. Her teenage son Tyler, hoodie half-zipped and holding a smartphone like it was an extension of his soul, leaned forward from the passenger seat. You need help, Linda called. We need divine intervention, Claire said. Tyler smirked. That tire is dead, man. Thank you, Sherlock, Evan replied. Linda offered bottled water from her cup holder stash, because Linda was the type who kept emergency snacks, first aid kits, and possibly apocalypse supplies in her trunk. Claire gratefully accepted one, and George waved his off. While George worked the jack like a seasoned pro, Evan stood nearby pretending he knew what he was doing. Claire chatted idly about how fall was her favorite season, because everything looks pretty even when it's dying, which Evan wasn't sure was motivational or deeply concerning. Then came the slapstick moment. As George tightened the jack and lifted the car frame slowly off the ground, Evan decided he wanted to help. He reached for the lug wrench, but the breeze chose that exact second to blow a swirl of leaves directly into his face. Eye contact, please, he shouted at nature. He stepped back, tripped on a fallen tree branch, flailed his arms like he was auditioning for a comedic dance routine, and landed squarely on his backside with a grunt. Tyler burst out laughing in the minivan. Claire stifled a giggle. Linda shook her head sympathetically but with a smile. George didn't even look up. You alive? Evan groaned. Physically or emotionally? Either. No. As Evan dusted leaves off his clothes, more cars slowed, waved, or honked in recognition. Maple Glen had a population just big enough for privacy to be questionable but small enough for strangers to feel like extended relatives. It was basically impossible to have a dramatic roadside moment without at least 7 people witnessing it. Finally, after George lifted the car enough, he instructed Evan to remove the lug nuts. Evan grabbed the wrench and turned counterclockwise, except he didn't actually loosen anything. The lug nut didn't budge, and Evan made an unflattering strained face expression that would haunt him if anyone had recorded it. Lefty Lucy, George reminded. I am going left, Evan grunted. You sure about that? Evan paused, looked at the wrench, looked again, maybe. Claire patted his shoulder again. Sweetheart, it's okay. I once tried to open a pickle jar for 15 minutes before realizing it was already open. With George's guidance and by guidance, meaning George did almost everything, the flat tire finally came off. But the drama wasn't finished. As Evan carried the ruined tire toward his trunk, he tripped again, this time on a slightly raised patch of gravel. The tire flew out of his hands like a giant rubber frisbee and rolled swiftly across the shoulder. No, stop. Evan shouted, sprinting, or something resembling a sprint, after it. The tire made a break for it like it had unfinished business with the highway. It rolled across the narrow road, weaving dangerously between 2 passing vehicles, one of which honked so loudly Evan nearly jumped out of his shoes. Eventually, the tire tipped over in the ditch on the opposite side. Evan climbed down to retrieve it, panting. Meanwhile, Claire whispered to Linda, poor guy. He's trying so hard. Linda nodded, he reminds me of my husband when he tries DIY projects. Tyler added, he reminds me of me trying to parallel park. Finally, after retrieving the runaway tire and bruising his pride, Evan placed the spare onto the hub. Under George's supervision, meaning constant corrections and mild groaning, the tire was secured, and the car was lowered. Evan stood back, exhausted but relieved. His hoodie smelled faintly of spilled coffee, crushed leaves, and the emotional equivalent of chaos. His hair was tousled by wind and embarrassment, and he looked like someone who had aged 3 years during a 15-minute roadside disaster. George wiped his hands. They're good as temporary. Temporary? Evan asked. It's a donut tire. You can't drive cross-country on it unless you want to fly off the road like a carnival ride. Evan rubbed his forehead. Right. Tire shop it is. Claire placed a hand on her hip. You need a ride? No, I'm okay. You sure? You look like you could use a snack and a pep talk. Tempting, honestly. Just as he was about to get into his car, the autumn breeze sent one last playful gust, tossing a cluster of leaves directly into his open door and onto his front seat like nature wanted to have the last laugh. Of course, Evan muttered. Why wouldn't that happen? But as he sat down and shut the door, he watched George climb back into his old pickup, Linda wave before driving off, and Claire shuffle toward her SUV with her cheerful floral sweater flapping in the wind. There was something undeniably wholesome, and painfully funny, about the whole situation. His morning had been ruined. His clothes were messy. His dignity was questionable. His coffee was gone. His tire was roadkill. But he wasn't alone. And somehow, that made everything feel less unbearable. Evan turned the key, and the engine hummed. He stared at the steering wheel, exhaled deeply, and chuckled. Unexpected roadside hero, he muttered. More like a whole squad. As he pulled back onto the road, the narrator of his life, if one existed, would have noted that sometimes the flat tire isn't the problem. Sometimes it's the opportunity. He just didn't know yet how big that opportunity was going to become. The sun had climbed higher over Maple Glen, burning through the lingering haze of early morning mist and casting long, warm shadows across the quiet roads. Oakridge Road, once the scene of Evan Parker's flat tire debacle, now seemed innocuous, almost peaceful. The scattered amber leaves glinted in the sun like tiny, fiery gems. But Evan knew better. He remembered how chaotic 15 minutes had felt yesterday, how quickly a small inconvenience could turn into a full-blown roadside spectacle. And yet, driving his car with the spare tire securely mounted, he felt a strange surge of pride. Sometimes, he thought, the universe delivers exactly the kind of trial you didn't know you needed. Evan's phone buzzed. It was a text from George Whitman. Roadside hero status confirmed. Coffee tomorrow, Evan smiled. Typing back a reply, he realized he'd never appreciated small-town camaraderie this much before. Every person who had shown up, the impatient teenager, the cheerful elderly lady, the meticulous neighbor, had contributed to a tiny miracle, turning a miserable morning into a lesson in humility, teamwork, and humor. Still, Evan's morning wasn't over. Today, he had to attend the Maple Glen Community Advisory Meeting, a gathering of local residents who debated everything from potholes to pumpkin festival logistics, usually with a mix of passion and passive-aggressive notes scribbled in agendas. His Civic, thankfully intact, rattled reassuringly over the small-town streets as he pulled up to the parking lot beside the community center, where Janice Peters, the rec center director, was already pacing like a small tornado. Evan, she called, spotting him. Thank goodness you're here. We need your expertise. Evan parked and stepped out, glancing around. Fall had deepened since yesterday, and the soft breeze carried the scent of wet leaves and distant wood smoke. He could almost hear the universe chuckling. What happened? He asked, reading her expression. Nothing catastrophic, yet, Janice replied. But our community festival committee ran into a problem. The pumpkin display shipment was delayed. And the centerpiece, the giant pumpkin for the carving contest, is stuck at the farm. Evan raised an eyebrow. You want me to? Yes. We need someone to improvise a solution, and you're the first person we thought of after yesterday. Evan blinked. After my flat tire fiasco? Janice nodded. If you can handle that level of chaos with humor and grace, you can handle anything. It sounded like praise. Or a threat. Probably both. Evan quickly texted the Maple Glen Chaos crew, the same heroes from yesterday, George, Claire, Linda, and Tyler. Within 20 minutes, the group reconvened at the community center, bringing their own quirks and expertise to the table. George arrived with his trusty toolbox and a folding cart, muttering about pumpkins being heavier than small cars. Claire had baked mini pumpkin muffins as a morale booster, wearing her floral sweater and carrying the aroma of fall sweetness with her. Linda arrived in her minivan, clipboard in hand, organized and calm, ready to delegate. Tyler leaned casually against the doorway, hoodie half-zipped, smartphone ready to document the chaos. Evan felt a rush of gratitude. If yesterday's flat tire had taught him anything, It was that community heroes appeared in the most unexpected forms. After surveying the situation, a giant, delayed pumpkin, a half-empty storage shed, and an impatient committee of town elders, Evan called for a brainstorm huddle. George scratched his beard. "We can rig a pulley system to lift the pumpkin off the truck." Claire, tilting her head, added, "Or we can roll it slowly on a carpeted platform, less likely to squash it." Linda, ever precise, whipped out a checklist. "We need safety, speed, and crowd control. Step 1, clear the children from the area." Tyler muttered, "Or we can film it like an action movie." Evan laughed. "Let's combine everything. Safety first, action film style second, and muffins third." The group got to work. George engineered a makeshift pulley system with ropes, pulleys, and a dolly. Claire supervised careful placement and cheering techniques to keep everyone calm. Linda controlled foot traffic and ran a mini logistics operation. Tyler filmed every step, narrating in a voice that sounded suspiciously like a sports commentator. Evan oversaw, occasionally jumping in to steady ropes, redirect traffic, or fetch coffee. It was chaos. It was comedy. And it was beautiful. Halfway through, a gust of early fall wind carried a loose tarp across the yard, smacking Evan squarely in the back of the head. He stumbled forward, catching himself on the pumpkin dolly, which rolled slightly, sending the pumpkin wobbling. "Evan, don't crush it," Claire shouted. Tyler, barely holding his phone steady, narrated, "He's wrestling the giant squash, folks. Will he survive? Tune in for pumpkin disaster coverage." George muttered, "I should have brought a helmet for this guy." Evan righted himself, red-faced, and finally got the pumpkin safely on the dolly. They rolled it slowly across the paved courtyard, dodging tables, decorations, and the occasional toddler chasing a stray leaf. Every few steps, Evan wobbled dangerously, Claire cheered, George corrected, and Tyler filmed, creating a perfect blend of chaos, laughter, and motivational teamwork. By the time they reached the festival display area, sweat-dampened hair and jackets, the pumpkins safe and slightly polished from their care, Evan realized something: the flat tire yesterday had been practice. This ridiculous pumpkin mission was the actual test of courage, patience, and improvised problem-solving. The pumpkin, once precarious and unwieldy, now sat proudly on its pedestal. Kids circled it, snapping photos, parents whispered in admiration, and even the committee elders gave quiet nods of approval. Evan wiped his forehead, looking around at the smiling faces. George wiping his hands on a rag with satisfaction, Claire handing muffins to the volunteers, Linda checking her clipboard one last time, Tyler still narrating into his phone with gusto. It was a moment of victory, yes, but deeper than that. It was symbolic. A flat tire, a runaway pumpkin, spilled coffee, and flailing limbs had led to something extraordinary: community, resilience, and laughter in the face of chaos. Evan realized he didn't need to be perfect. He didn't need to be heroic in isolation. Sometimes, showing up, trying your best, and letting others join in was all it took. After the pumpkin was safely positioned, the group gathered around with tired smiles and orange-stained hands. Evan, standing at the center, finally allowed himself a small, satisfied grin. "You know," he said, voice catching slightly in mock seriousness, "I think we just solved the ultimate community puzzle. Flat tire yesterday, pumpkin today. Who knows what's next? Maybe a runaway parade float." Claire laughed. "Bring it on." George patted him on the back. "You learned fast. Life's little disasters aren't the enemy. They're the invitation to do something better than you imagined." Linda added, "And sometimes, they reveal heroes you didn't expect, like all of us." Tyler raised his phone for one final selfie with the pumpkin. Everyone squeezed in, faces glowing with fall light, leaves falling around them like confetti. Evan looked at the group and thought, flat tire, spilled coffee, runaway pumpkins, all of it was worth it. The morning sun dipped lower, gilding the Maple Glen streets in warm amber, and Evan felt a satisfying hum in his chest. He hadn't just survived chaos, he'd been part of it, and together, they'd made something memorable, something real, something laughable, something worth telling. Sometimes the flat tire wasn't the problem. Sometimes the pumpkin wasn't the problem. Sometimes, it was the people you met along the way, and the ridiculous adventures you shared, that made everything worthwhile. And as he left the community center, Evan Parker didn't just drive away with a working tire. He drove away with a renewed sense of optimism, laughter tucked into his pockets, and a reminder that life's minor disasters often carried the most unexpected joys.
Daily happiness and motivation is hitting in. Like and subscribe.